Nobody paid attention to the woman in the gray sweater sitting in economy, just another passenger heading home for Christmas. But when lightning struck United 783 and systems failed catastrophically, Colonel Victoria Sterling's legendary call sign Ghost would soon have F-22 pilots standing at attention in the cockpit, honoring the hero who saved 180 lives. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. It was a stormy Thursday evening, December 21, 2024, when United Airlines Flight 783 prepared for departure from Los Angeles International Airport bound for New York's JFK. The Boeing 777-300ER was packed with 180 passengers and crew members eager to reach the East Coast before the Christmas weekend, despite weather reports showing severe turbulence and thunderstorms across the continental United States. The departure gate was bustling with holiday travelers checking their phones, organizing carry-on luggage, and making last-minute calls to family members about their arrival times in New York. Among them sat Colonel Victoria Ghost Sterling, a woman in her early 40s wearing simple black jeans, a gray wool sweater, and worn leather boots that suggested someone who preferred comfort over fashion during long flights. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, secured with a plain elastic band that had seen better days, and she wore no makeup except subtle lip balm that protected against the dry cabin air she knew would characterize the cross-country flight. Her only jewelry was a thin silver chain that disappeared beneath her sweater collar, carrying dog tags that she never removed but kept hidden from civilian view. Victoria had deliberately chosen seat 14C, a middle seat in the economy section that most frequent travelers would avoid at all costs, but she didn't mind being squeezed between other passengers during the 5.5-hour flight to JFK. Everything about her appearance and seating choice suggested another business traveler heading home for the holidays, perhaps a consultant or sales manager catching a red-eye flight after a long week of client meetings in Southern California. Her small carry-on bag contained what appeared to be typical business travel essentials: laptop, charging cables, snacks, and a paperback novel to pass the time during the flight. The flight attendant conducting pre-flight safety checks, Maria Santos, barely noticed Victoria as she verified seatbelts and tray table positions throughout the economy cabin. Maria had been flying for United for 7 years and had developed the ability to quickly assess passenger needs and potential problems, but nothing about the quiet woman in 14C suggested she would be anything other than a routine passenger who would probably sleep through most of the flight. If Maria had looked more carefully, she might have noticed the way Victoria's eyes automatically tracked emergency exit locations, assessed overhead bin configurations, and mentally cataloged the passenger manifest with the unconscious situational awareness that never left someone who had spent 15 years flying combat missions in the world's most dangerous airspace. What none of the passengers or crew members could have known was that Colonel Victoria Sterling was one of the most decorated combat pilots in United States military history, whose service record remained classified at levels that most Pentagon officials had never seen. She had flown over 200 combat sorties in F-22 Raptors and F-35 Lightning fighters, had commanded elite squadrons in classified operations across 3 continents, and had earned the call sign Ghost for her legendary ability to appear and disappear in hostile airspace without enemy forces ever detecting her presence until it was far too late for them to respond effectively. Her military record included the Distinguished Flying Cross with 2 oak leaf clusters, 3 Air Medals for heroism in combat, the Defense Superior Service Medal, and commendations from allied nations whose existence remained classified even among senior Pentagon officials who held top-secret clearances. She had flown missions over territories that didn't officially exist on any maps, had tested experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of human endurance and technological capability, and had trained other pilots in combat techniques that had saved countless American and Allied lives during operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. But tonight she was just another passenger trying to get home to Virginia for Christmas, traveling in civilian clothes on a commercial airliner like millions of other Americans during the holiday season. She had retired from active military service 6 months earlier after a distinguished career that had taken her from rookie pilot fresh out of the Air Force Academy to squadron commander responsible for some of the most sensitive and dangerous missions in modern warfare. She was still adjusting to the quiet routine of civilian life after decades of constant deployment, classified briefings, and life-or-death decision-making in combat zones where split-second mistakes could result in international incidents or the loss of entire strike packages. The passenger sitting to her right, elderly Mrs. Dorothy Yamamoto from Pasadena, was traveling to New York to spend Christmas with her grandchildren who had moved to Manhattan for work opportunities. She smiled warmly at Victoria as they settled in for the long flight. "Are you heading home for the holidays, dear?" she asked with the friendly curiosity that characterized long-haul flights during December. Family or business? Victoria returned her smile with genuine warmth, though she was careful not to reveal details about her travel plans that might lead to questions about her background. A little of both, she replied diplomatically, not mentioning that she was actually traveling to attend a series of classified Pentagon briefings about advanced aviation technologies that remain top secret even from most military personnel. Christmas is always a busy time for travel. Captain Robert Mitchell and First Officer Jennifer Walsh completed their extensive pre-flight preparations in the cockpit, both experienced pilots with clean safety records but no awareness that one of their passengers had logged more flight hours in advanced military aircraft than both of them combined, despite being several years younger than either of them. Mitchell had been flying for United for 12 years, accumulating over 8,000 flight hours in commercial aircraft, while Walsh was an experienced first officer with 6,500 hours who was working toward her captain upgrade and had an excellent reputation among her peers for professionalism and technical competence. Both pilots were concerned about the weather reports showing severe conditions along their planned route to New York, with multiple thunderstorm cells, moderate to severe turbulence, and the potential for wind shear that could make their flight uncomfortable for passengers and challenging for the crew. They had reviewed alternate airports along their route, discussed fuel requirements for potential diversions, and coordinated with United's dispatch office about the best strategies for navigating the storm systems that were moving across the continental United States. At exactly 8:45 p.m. Pacific Time, Flight 783 pushed back from Gate 74B and began the lengthy taxi toward runway 25R, joining a queue of aircraft waiting for departure clearance in the busy Los Angeles International Airport airspace. As they moved through the airport's complex ground operations, Victoria gazed out her window at the other aircraft and ground equipment with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years analyzing airport security, traffic patterns, and operational procedures from both military and intelligence perspectives. Unlike other passengers who saw routine airport activity, she was automatically analyzing traffic patterns, noting security protocols, observing the professional coordination that kept one of the world's busiest airports functioning safely, and mentally cataloging information that might prove useful if any unusual situations developed during their departure or flight. Her training had taught her that situational awareness was not something that could be turned on and off. It was a constant state of mind that had kept her alive through countless dangerous situations and had become as natural as breathing. The businessman sitting to her left, David Park from downtown LA, was reviewing presentation materials on his laptop as they waited in the departure queue. He glanced over at Victoria occasionally, noting her calm demeanor and the way she seemed completely comfortable with the lengthy taxi delay that was making other passengers restless and anxious about their departure time. "Heading home for the holidays?" he asked with the friendly curiosity that characterized cross-country flights during December. "Business or family?" Victoria smiled with the reserved politeness that she had learned to use when civilians asked about her travel plans, never revealing details that might lead to questions about her background or current activities. "A little of both," she replied diplomatically, not mentioning that she was actually traveling to attend classified Pentagon briefings about advanced aviation technologies, threat assessments, and strategic planning sessions that involved some of the most sensitive military information in the United States government. At 9:03 p.m. Pacific Time, Flight 783 finally received takeoff clearance and lifted off into the turbulent California sky, immediately encountering the rough air that had been forecast for their route across the western United States. The Boeing 777 climbed steadily through layers of clouds and precipitation, with lightning visible in the distance and moderate turbulence that had several passengers gripping their armrests nervously while flight attendants secured loose items in the galley areas and prepared for what promised to be a challenging flight to the East Coast. Victoria felt the familiar sensation of flight that had defined most of her adult life, though this time as a passenger rather than the pilot in control of advanced military aircraft capable of speeds and maneuvers that commercial aviation could never attempt. She automatically noted the aircraft's climb rate, the pilot's technique in handling the turbulence, and the way the Boeing 777 responded to atmospheric conditions that would have been routine in the high-performance fighters she had flown during her military career. The first 2 hours of the flight proceeded normally despite continuous moderate turbulence that kept the seatbelt sign illuminated and prevented normal cabin service throughout most of the aircraft. Flight attendants moved carefully through the aisles when possible, checking on passengers and providing reassurance about the rough conditions, while the pilots coordinated with air traffic control centers across multiple states as they navigated around the most severe weather cells. As they crossed into Colorado airspace, Captain Mitchell was monitoring weather radar that showed increasingly severe conditions ahead, with thunderstorm cells reaching altitudes above their planned flight level and wind patterns that suggested they might encounter more significant turbulence than they had experienced during the first portion of their flight. The storms were still manageable for a modern commercial aircraft with experienced crew and proper procedures, but they represented the kind of challenging conditions that required constant attention and careful decision-making. What none of them could anticipate was the catastrophic sequence of events that would soon test everyone aboard Flight 783 beyond anything they had ever imagined possible, pushing the limits of both human capability and aircraft systems in ways that would require expertise far beyond standard commercial aviation training to survive. At 11:47 p.m. Mountain Time, as Flight 783 flew through a particularly intense thunderstorm over eastern Colorado at 38,000 feet, the aircraft was struck by lightning that should have been harmlessly conducted through the fuselage and dissipated without causing any damage to the aircraft's systems or affecting the safety of flight operations. Modern commercial aircraft were designed to handle lightning strikes routinely, with sophisticated protection systems that had been proven through thousands of incidents over decades of commercial aviation. But this particular lightning strike carried an electrical charge far exceeding normal parameters, generated by atmospheric conditions that created a perfect storm of electrical activity unlike anything in the meteorological records for the region. The massive electrical surge found a microscopic flaw in the aircraft's electrical shielding that had gone undetected through thousands of flight hours and routine maintenance inspections, creating a pathway for devastating electrical damage that cascaded through multiple aircraft systems simultaneously. The surge instantly overloaded the aircraft's primary electrical systems, causing failures that cascaded through backup systems faster than the crew could identify and respond to individual problems. The primary flight computers crashed completely, taking with them the autopilot, navigation systems, weather radar, and most of the electronic displays that modern pilots depended on for safe flight operations in challenging weather conditions. Emergency lighting flickered throughout the cabin as passengers felt the aircraft lurch violently to one side and begin an uncontrolled descent that would quickly become unsurvivable without immediate intervention. Captain Mitchell found himself staring at instrument panels that had gone completely dark, leaving him with only basic mechanical gauges and his own flying skills to control a massive aircraft carrying 180 people through severe turbulence with virtually no electronic assistance. "Jesus Christ, we've lost everything," he said to First Officer Walsh, his voice tight with stress as he struggled to maintain control using only rudimentary backup instruments that provided minimal information about the aircraft's condition. "Flight computers, navigation, communications, weather radar, everything's gone dark." The situation became even more desperate when the aircraft's hydraulic systems began failing as a secondary result of the electrical damage, making the flight controls increasingly difficult to operate and threatening to leave the pilots with no ability to maintain controlled flight at all. Warning alarms that were still functional filled the cockpit with urgent alerts about multiple system failures, while the aircraft continued its gradual descent toward the rocky terrain of eastern Colorado with extremely limited options for emergency landing sites that could accommodate a Boeing 777 in distress. First Officer Walsh was working frantically through emergency checklists, trying to identify which systems were still operational and which backup procedures might be available to help them regain control of their aircraft. "Hydraulic pressure is dropping in all three systems," she reported, her voice steady despite the desperate nature of their situation. "Flight controls are becoming increasingly unresponsive, and we're losing altitude at approximately 500 feet per minute." In the passenger cabin, people were beginning to panic as they realized something was seriously wrong with their flight that went far beyond the turbulence they had been experiencing earlier. The lights flickered intermittently between emergency power and complete darkness, oxygen masks deployed automatically as cabin pressure began fluctuating due to electrical failures affecting pressurization systems, and the aircraft's increasingly erratic movements suggested the pilots were struggling with significant control problems that went far beyond normal atmospheric turbulence. Flight attendants Maria Santos, Jennifer Park, and Robert Chin moved through the aisles as safely as possible, trying to keep passengers calm while coordinating with the cockpit about the nature of the emergency they were facing and the procedures they needed to implement to prepare for potential evacuation or crash landing. Their training had covered various emergency scenarios, but nothing had prepared them for multiple simultaneous system failures that threatened the aircraft's ability to maintain controlled flight. Victoria Sterling had immediately recognized the signs of catastrophic system failure from her years of flying advanced military aircraft in combat conditions where multiple emergencies, battle damage, and system failures were routine occurrences that pilots had to handle while also dealing with hostile fire and complex tactical situations. The specific pattern of electrical failures, the particular way the aircraft was responding to control inputs, and the distinctive sound of struggling hydraulic systems told her they were facing a combination of problems that exceeded the training and experience of most commercial pilots, even highly competent professionals like Captain Mitchell and First Officer Walsh. She also understood that they had very little time before the cascading failures would make the aircraft completely uncontrollable, leading to a crash that would kill everyone aboard unless someone with advanced emergency training intervened immediately. Her military training kicked in automatically as she began analyzing their options and considering emergency procedures that might save the aircraft, though most of those procedures were classified techniques that civilian pilots would never have learned during their commercial aviation training or recurrent qualification programs. The passenger sitting next to her, Mrs. Yamamoto, was gripping her armrest with white knuckles as the aircraft continued its erratic flight path. "What's happening?" she asked Victoria with the fear that was visible in passengers throughout the cabin. "Is the airplane going to crash?" Victoria placed a reassuring hand on the elderly woman's arm while her mind raced through the emergency procedures that might be applicable to their desperate situation. "The pilots are dealing with some technical problems," she said calmly, not wanting to increase the panic that was already spreading through the cabin. "They're trained professionals who know how to handle emergency situations." But even as she spoke those reassuring words, Victoria understood that this particular emergency was rapidly exceeding the capabilities of commercial aviation training and procedures. When the cabin lights went out completely for nearly 30 seconds before flickering back to emergency power, she knew the situation had reached a critical point where civilian aviation protocols would not be sufficient to prevent disaster. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, immediately drawing the attention of nearby passengers who wondered why someone would be moving around the cabin during such obvious turbulence and emergency conditions. "Ma'am, please return to your seat immediately," called out Maria Santos, the flight attendant who was struggling to maintain order in the cabin while coordinating with other crew members about the emergency procedures they needed to implement. "We're experiencing severe turbulence and need everyone seated with seatbelts fastened for safety." "I need to speak with the captain," Victoria said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that made Maria pause and really look at her for the first time since the flight began. There was something in Victoria's tone and bearing that suggested she was not just another panicked passenger, but someone who understood the gravity of their situation and might actually be able to help in ways that normal passengers could not. "I'm sorry, but passengers aren't allowed in the cockpit during flight operations, especially during emergency situations," Maria replied, following standard airline protocols that prohibited unauthorized personnel from accessing the flight deck under any circumstances. "The pilots are trained professionals who can handle whatever problems we're experiencing. The pilots are about to lose control of this aircraft completely," Victoria said with calm certainty that made several nearby passengers stop their own panicked conversations and listen to what she was saying. "I can hear multiple system failures, feel the hydraulic degradation, and recognize the flight envelope deterioration that indicates you have maybe 5 minutes before this becomes unsurvivable for everyone aboard." David Park, the businessman sitting next to Victoria, stared at her with growing amazement as he processed the technical language she was using and the professional competence she was demonstrating. "How could you possibly know all that?" he asked, his voice mixing curiosity with the hope that maybe this mysterious woman actually did understand their situation better than he had initially realized. "Because I'm a pilot," Victoria replied simply, not elaborating on the decades of advanced military training and combat experience that had taught her to recognize and respond to emergency situations that would overwhelm most civilian aviators. "And unless someone with advanced training helps your flight crew right now, everyone on this aircraft is going to die in the next few minutes." The blunt assessment sent a chill through the passengers who could hear her words, but it also convinced Maria Santos that this woman might actually possess the expertise she claimed to have. The flight attendant's training emphasized passenger safety above all other considerations, and if there was any possibility that this passenger could provide assistance that might save lives, she had to at least allow her to try. "What kind of pilot are you?" Maria asked, making a split-second decision that would either violate airline policies or potentially save everyone aboard Flight 783. "What qualifications do you have that could help in this situation?" United States Air Force, retired colonel, 15 years of combat operations in advanced fighters, Victoria said as she moved toward the cockpit with the confident stride of someone accustomed to taking command during crisis situations. "I've handled emergency scenarios that make this look routine, and I know procedures that can save this aircraft if we implement them immediately." The cockpit of Flight 783 was a scene of controlled chaos when Victoria entered, with Captain Mitchell and First Officer Walsh working frantically to maintain control using the few remaining functional instruments while trying to diagnose and respond to multiple simultaneous system failures. Both pilots looked up with surprise and concern when they saw an unauthorized passenger entering their workspace during the most challenging emergency of their careers. "Who is this and why is she in my cockpit?" Captain Mitchell demanded, his stress level already at maximum as he struggled with flight controls that were becoming less responsive by the minute. "We don't have time for passenger interference right now. Captain, I'm Colonel Victoria Sterling, United States Air Force retired," Victoria said as she quickly assessed the instrument panels and began mentally cataloging the extent of their system failures. "I have extensive experience with multiple emergency scenarios in advanced aircraft, and I can provide assistance that may save this flight." Mitchell and Walsh exchanged glances, both recognizing that their situation was deteriorating rapidly and that they needed help from any qualified source available. Mitchell had heard of military pilots with emergency training that exceeded civilian aviation standards, and if this woman actually possessed the expertise she claimed, she might be their only hope for survival. "What do you see that we're missing?" Walsh asked, willing to listen to anyone who might have solutions they hadn't considered. "We've lost most of our systems and we're barely maintaining controlled flight." Victoria studied the remaining functional displays and immediately identified several critical problems that the civilian pilots hadn't recognized due to their different training background. "Your primary issue isn't just electrical failure," she said with professional precision. "The lightning strike created a cascade effect that's causing progressive hydraulic degradation, flight computer corruption, and structural stress that will lead to complete loss of control within minutes unless you implement emergency procedures that aren't covered in standard commercial training." "What procedures?" Mitchell asked, his respect for Victoria's competence growing as he recognized she was analyzing their situation with expertise that exceeded his own. "What can we do that we haven't already tried?" Victoria began coordinating the most complex emergency response of her career, applying 15 years of advanced military training to a civilian aircraft emergency that required techniques and procedures that had never been attempted on a commercial flight. Working with Mitchell and Walsh as a coordinated team, she implemented a combination of manual flight control techniques, emergency systems management, and tactical decision-making that gradually brought their desperate situation under control. "First, we need to isolate the corrupted flight computers and switch to pure manual control," Victoria instructed as she began implementing procedures she had learned during classified training programs. "Then we'll use differential power management to compensate for hydraulic losses, implement emergency descent protocols to reduce structural stress, and coordinate with air traffic control for immediate diversion to the nearest suitable airport." What followed was a masterpiece of aviation skill and emergency coordination that demonstrated why Victoria Sterling had earned her legendary reputation during her military career. Working together with perfect precision, the three pilots executed a series of complex maneuvers and system modifications that gradually stabilized Flight 783 and established a controlled descent toward Denver International Airport, where emergency response teams were already mobilizing to assist with their arrival. The approach and landing at Denver International would later be studied as one of the most skillful pieces of emergency flying in commercial aviation history. With most electronic systems still non-functional, Victoria coordinated manual navigation while Mitchell and Walsh handled flight controls and communication with air traffic control. Her ability to calculate approach angles, monitor multiple system parameters, and provide tactical guidance under extreme pressure demonstrated the kind of advanced skills that had made her one of the most respected combat pilots of her generation. Flight 783 touched down safely on runway 34R at Denver International Airport at 12:43 a.m. Mountain Time, nearly 4 hours after the lightning strike that had threatened to kill everyone aboard. Emergency vehicles immediately surrounded the aircraft as the three pilots brought it to a complete stop, their coordinated effort having saved 180 lives through a combination of skill, training, and tactical excellence that few aviators could have achieved under such challenging circumstances. As the passengers evacuated the aircraft using emergency slides, many of them sought out Victoria to thank her personally for her role in saving their lives. David Park was among the first to find her in the terminal, his voice filled with emotion as he expressed his gratitude. "You saved all of us, didn't you?" he said. "We would have died without your help." Victoria accepted his thanks with the modesty that had always characterized her approach to military service and emergency situations. "Captain Mitchell and First Officer Walsh deserve the real credit," she replied. "They flew that approach perfectly under impossible conditions. I just provided some additional technical guidance when it was needed." But the story of Flight 783 was far from over. As news of the emergency spread through military channels, Victoria's identity and role in the successful rescue became known to Air Force personnel monitoring civilian aviation emergencies. When two F-22 Raptor pilots conducting training exercises in Colorado airspace learned that Colonel Ghost Sterling had been aboard the civilian aircraft and had coordinated the emergency response, their reaction was immediate and profound. Major Sarah Viper Rodriguez and Captain Mike Talone Williams were flying routine patrol missions when they received word through military communications that the legendary Ghost had just saved a commercial airliner using advanced emergency procedures. Both pilots had heard stories of Victoria Sterling's combat record throughout their own military careers, and they understood they were learning about someone whose achievements represented the absolute pinnacle of military aviation excellence. Control, Viper and Talone requesting permission to honor Colonel Sterling with ceremonial flyby, Rodriguez radioed to their ground control facility. "We have confirmation that Ghost coordinated the successful emergency response for United 783, and we request authorization to render appropriate military honors." The response came back immediately, "Viper and Talone, you are authorized for ceremonial flyby. Colonel Sterling's service record warrants full military honors. Execute precision formation flight as tribute to one of our most decorated combat pilots." As Victoria stood in the Denver International Terminal coordinating with airline officials and emergency personnel, she heard the distinctive sound of F-22 Raptors approaching the airport at high speed. Looking through the terminal windows, she saw two of the most advanced fighters in the world executing a perfect formation flyby directly over the airport, their pilots standing at attention in their cockpits as they passed overhead in a display of military respect that brought tears to her eyes. The other passengers and crew members from Flight 783 watched in amazement as the F-22s performed a second precision flyby, this time accompanied by radio communications that filled the airport's emergency frequencies with tributes to Colonel Sterling's legendary service and her role in saving their lives. Airport personnel, emergency responders, and airline officials all stood in respectful silence as they witnessed an unprecedented display of military honor for someone whose courage and expertise had prevented a tragedy that would have claimed 180 lives. "Ladies and gentlemen," came an announcement over the airport's public address system. "The United States Air Force is conducting a ceremonial flyby in honor of retired Colonel Victoria Sterling, whose extraordinary aviation expertise and heroic actions saved the lives of everyone aboard United Flight 783. The F-22 pilots executing this tribute are standing at attention in recognition of Colonel Sterling's distinguished service to our nation and her life-saving actions tonight." The passengers from Flight 783 began to understand that the quiet woman in seat 14C who had seemed like just another holiday traveler was actually a decorated war hero whose military achievements commanded instant respect from the most elite pilots in the world. Many of them had never witnessed such a display of military honor, and they began to realize that Victoria Sterling represented something far beyond their initial understanding. Captain Mitchell approached Victoria with profound respect and gratitude as the F-22s completed their final flyby and departed into the Colorado night sky. "Colonel Sterling, I've been flying for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what you did tonight," he said quietly. "Your knowledge, your leadership under pressure, your ability to coordinate complex emergency procedures, you saved every single person aboard that aircraft." Victoria watched the F-22s disappear into the distance, thinking about the young pilots who had just honored her with a tribute that meant more to her than any medal or commendation she had ever received. Those pilots represented the next generation of military aviators who would carry on the traditions of excellence, service, and sacrifice that had defined her own career and the careers of countless others who had served their country in the skies above battlefields around the world. "It's what we do," she said simply, using the same phrase that had characterized her approach to military service throughout her distinguished career. "When people need help and you have the skills to provide it, you help. That's the code we live by in military aviation, and it doesn't change when you retire from active duty." The story of United Flight 783 and Colonel Victoria Ghost Sterling would become legendary in both civilian and military aviation circles, not just because of the successful emergency response but because it demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities that military training could provide when civilian aviation faced impossible challenges. Victoria had been completely anonymous that evening, just another passenger trying to get home for the holidays, but when catastrophic emergency threatened 180 lives, she had stepped forward with the skills and courage that 15 years of combat flying had given her. The investigation into Flight 783's emergency would reveal that the lightning strike and subsequent system failures had created conditions that exceeded the training and capabilities of most commercial pilots, and that the successful outcome was due primarily to Victoria's advanced military training and her ability to implement emergency procedures that were not covered in civilian aviation curricula. Her actions would lead to recommendations about incorporating military emergency techniques into commercial pilot training programs. 3 months later, Victoria received an invitation to speak at the annual symposium of the International Association of Military Flight Test Pilots, where she would address the topic of applying combat aviation skills to civilian emergencies. Her presentation would focus on the importance of maintaining proficiency in advanced emergency procedures and the critical value of military training in developing the kind of tactical thinking that could save lives when conventional approaches proved inadequate. But that night in Denver, as Victoria finally boarded her rescheduled flight to Virginia, she reflected on the events that had transformed a routine holiday trip into a life-or-death emergency that had required every skill she had learned during her military career. She had been only a passenger in seat 14C when the crisis began, invisible among 180 other travelers, but when lightning struck and systems failed catastrophically, the aviation community had once again called upon Ghost to serve when service was desperately needed. The F-22 pilot's tribute had reminded her that military aviation was more than just a career. It was a brotherhood and sisterhood of warriors who understood that their training and capabilities came with obligations that lasted far beyond active duty. Tonight she had honored those obligations by using her skills to save lives when civilian aviation reached the limits of its capabilities, proving once again that the call sign Ghost represented someone who appeared when needed most and delivered results that others thought impossible. As her new flight took off into the clear Colorado sky, Victoria settled back in her seat and closed her eyes, knowing that she had done her duty one more time and that 180 families would be reunited for Christmas because military training had prepared her to handle emergencies that exceeded civilian capabilities. Tomorrow she would be just another retired officer attending Pentagon briefings, but tonight she had been Ghost once more, demonstrating why legends never truly retire. They just wait for the moment when their extraordinary abilities are needed to save lives and serve their fellow human beings. The woman who had saved 180 passengers would always be remembered not just for her technical skills or tactical expertise, but for the way she had inspired F-22 pilots to stand at attention in tribute to someone whose lifetime of service represented the very best of military aviation excellence. Colonel Victoria Ghost Sterling had proven that heroes don't seek recognition. They simply step forward when duty calls, carrying the training and courage that make the impossible seem routine and the desperate seem manageable.